There have been thousands of protesters who have taken to the streets in Israel. But do you actually believe it changes anything for the Netanyahu government?
I do think that the pressure is getting substantially more. I think the protests are the largest since October 7th. I know that Netanyahu still does have an electoral lock on his prime ministership as long as he keeps these right-wing ministers in his camp. Nonetheless, I think when there's so many people putting all this pressure on every side of the system, I do think it starts to create a situation where there are too many vibrations and things might, in time, begin to unravel.
We heard today from the State Department, in fact, State Department spokesperson Mathieu Miller talking about this. He spoke about the U.S.
Israel and it requires Hamas to make difficult decisions to reach an agreement. And what we will continue to do on behalf of the United States, and what we believe Qatar and Egypt will continue to do, is to impress upon those parties why an agreement is in their interest and why an agreement is in the interest of the region. But ultimately, we're not the ones that can make that decision.
Much of the sticking point has been around what to do with the Philadelphi corridor along the border that Gaza shares with Egypt. Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to leave. There are members of his war cabinet who think that a temporary withdrawal might actually help to grease the skids on a ceasefire. Would that be enough to do it?
I doubt it would be enough because in addition to the Philadelphia corridor, the Hamas leader Sinwar wants Netanyahu to say the war is completely over, whereas permanent ceasefire, whereas the Israelis want to be able to go back in if they see some sort of reemergence of Hamas somewhere within Gaza. I also think there's still issues about just which Hamas terrorists would be released from prison. There's a dispute on Hamas wants to turn over the exact names of people, whereas the Israelis are more general and say, we'll let this number of Hamas insurgents be released from prison. So I think there's still other stumbling points beyond this one. This one's just the most tangible. This is the one that seems to have come on the latest, and that's the one that's getting all of the attention since last Thursday. There was this huge dispute within the security cabinet in Israel where they almost came to fisticuffs over what the Israeli policy should be.
We did have some news breaking just a few minutes ago from the Department of Justice, who announced charges against Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, and others for their roles in planning, supporting, and perpetrating the October 7th attack on Israel. What does that really accomplish? Does that actually perhaps make it more difficult to reach a ceasefire agreement if the U.S. is a mediator in this, is pursuing criminal charges against the leader of the organization?
You know, I'm more from the post-9/11 school of they have declared war on people. This is more like war than it is law enforcement. And to just issue an indictment, I think, sort of sends a message of U.S. weakness. Where the United States needs to have been stronger for many months, and it's not too late, is that Hamas is backed by Iran. Iran should have been receiving so much more pressure from us. Oil sanctions, which we've talked about before, any number of other military actions that we could have taken, not war, but to put pressure on them to ultimately say to Hamas and their other terrorist proxies in the region, hey, you know what, it's time to scale things down a bit. They haven't done that. I think the Biden administration is sort of ideologically thinking we've got to be able to get some sort of arrangement with Iran and talk to them more, but it hasn't worked. And so therefore you see the administration beat up Israel for not making enough concessions instead of the other side.
I want to ask you about what's happening in Ukraine as we balance these two stories. Michael, earlier today, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, shared this video on X, what we used to call Twitter, following a Russian missile strike that has renewed his call for help to close the skies, as he puts it.
I received preliminary reports regarding the Russian strike on Poltava. According to the information available now, 2 ballistic missiles hit the territory of an educational institution and a neighboring hospital. One of the buildings of the Communications Institute was partially destroyed. People were trapped under the rubble. Many were rescued. More than 180 people were injured. Unfortunately, many people were killed.
Michael, Russian missiles killed more than 50 people in what was one of the deadliest strikes. But of course, just days ago, we were talking about this successful incursion, this cross-border incursion that Ukraine has brought to Russia, the continued drone strikes by Ukraine against Russia. We're seeing a lot of retaliation now. Is this war headed for some sort of crescendo in the near term?
I still think fundamentally it's more along the lines of a stalemate than it is to some sort of dynamic battlefield situation. Mm-hmm. However, there are, as you mentioned, the Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians. They have made substantial sojourns into that particular territory. And of course, it's not, we don't hear about it as much, but the Russians are continuing to make steady progress in the Donbass. So everyone is trying to figure out who's going to pull out troops first to defend against the incursion by the other side. There's a lot going on, and you're right, the Russians keep hitting the other side and trying to cause civilian casualties as if to say, we are not letting you get away from this easily.
Well, and of course, Zelensky is re-upping his calls for more air defense systems as a result. They have Patriot missile systems. They've been given the first batch of F-16s, even though we learned last week that they had actually lost one. What could actually help Ukraine avoid attacks like this in the future that the U.S. and other Western allies aren't currently providing? It's
more Patriot weapon systems, first and foremost. Honestly, Greece, Spain, there are other NATO allies. I know they don't want to give up their systems, but they could stand to donate their systems and the missiles that are accompanying them to the Ukrainians. That's what we ought to be focusing on. There are other air defense systems which are also important, but honestly, it's more Patriots from nations that don't really need them because of where they sit in the NATO alliance.